Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. A big welcome to all of you. My name is Laura, and I'm delighted that you are joining us for today's ESPC community webinar. This is the third webinar of Power Platform Week, and today I am joined by Andy Huneycutt, who is coming in all the way from the United States, and he is going to talk to you guys about SharePoint expressions and functions in Power Automate. We love hearing what you guys have to say, so remember to join in on the conversation about today's webinar and more on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is #ESPC23. Tweet us, at us, and tell us what you learned. Don't forget to check out our resource centre, which is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. You can access and view the resource centre by visiting our website, sharepointeurope.com, and clicking the content tab at the top. Don't let the learning stop here. Continue to keep up and stay ahead by joining us for our next webinar, e-signatures and payments in Power Pages. This webinar takes place on Wednesday, September 13th from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. CEST. For more information on this webinar, check out sharepointeurope.com/Power Platform Week. ESPC is fast approaching. If you are looking for a vibrant Microsoft 365 and Azure conference that is jam-packed with groundbreaking insights, visionary keynotes, hands-on workshops, and exciting networking opportunities, then it is time to secure your early bird tickets for ESPC. But why should you attend ESPC? Well, at ESPC, you can receive valuable insights by attending a variety of session types across the biggest Microsoft 365 and Azure topics, catering from level 100 to 400. Hear from Microsoft product team members, regional directors, MVPs, MCMs, and independent experts. ESPC is also a great way for you to build your professional network and meet like-minded people from across the globe. Share and receive advice from fellow attendees, but also from our very friendly and helpful speakers. ESPC also helps you to keep up and get ahead with product developments and practices that matter most. You can find new and better ways of working to bring new energy and effectiveness to your work. And you can also expect the latest news straight from Ignite. So invest in your team, invest in yourself, and invest in your career by learning new skills or mastering current ones at ESPC. Book before September 29th to avail of our early bird pricing and our special team discounts. To find out more about early bird pricing and our special team discounts, visit sharepointeurope.com/pricing. At ESPC, there will be over 20 Microsoft Power Platform sessions to choose from. Topics include Power Apps, Power BI, Power Pages, Power Automate, ChatGPT, Dataverse, custom connectors, and much, much more. Don't miss out on this fantastic learning opportunity. Visit sharepointeurope.com/conference/schedule/2023 to check out the wide range of Power Platform sessions available at ESPC. So after the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any question you might have into the questions window. Questions will then be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Centre, where you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter today, Andy. Hello, Andy.
Hi there, good morning. All right, thank you. I am happy to be here this morning. Hopefully everybody can see my screen, but good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm really excited for today's presentation, so let's go ahead and dive right in. So this is going to be Power Automate, how to work with expressions and functions specifically in SharePoint. I'd say this is kind of a level 100 to 200 talk, where we're going to get the foundation to successfully work with expressions and functions and to be able to leverage that as part of our Power Automate Toolkit. So let's go ahead and start off. A little bit of information about me. I am based out of the United States. I'm on the East Coast in North Carolina, so it's bright and early for me here in the Carolinas. I've been in the SharePoint space for 15 years. I've progressed like many people from SharePoint into the Power Platform, but I do all things Microsoft 365, whether it's SharePoint Teams, Power Automate, some Power Apps, Power Platform, and here more recently working a lot with Copilot. I'm considered an enterprise content specialist, so I do a little bit of everything, but mainly I work in user adoption, training, and education. And I use these tools for my productivity so that I can provide user adoption and education to an organization of upwards of 200,000 people. I work on a small team as part of that, and we are trying to scale our resources as much as possible, and Power Automate is one of the tools that we use for that. So in 2017, I got awarded Microsoft MVP, or recognized by Microsoft as an MVP for my community contributions. Really happy to be a part of that program. And then I've got some contact information where you can find me across the various platforms. On Twitter, X, I am Andy Huneycutt. On LinkedIn, I'm William. That's my first name, but I go by Andy. And you also find me on YouTube in a couple of different places. But you're not here to learn about me. You're here to learn about Power Automate. So let's go ahead and dive in. So Power Automate's a great way to automate business processes. And I like to think of it at 3 different levels. There's personal productivity, there's daily team activities, and then there's enterprise processes. And depending on what we're trying to work with is the kind of the avenue that we take. I think most often when people work with Power Automate, they're working with daily team activities. They're trying to figure out a way to interact with their team, maybe approval processes, processing documentation as it comes in. But for me, I tend to gravitate toward personal productivity because Power Automate helps me get my work done. It helps me to spend less time through some of the mundane emails and communications and follow-ups, and to be able to focus more on the creative side of the work that I do. And I really appreciate that. So for me, the personal productivity is where I really gain a lot of advantages with Power Automate. And then on the other side, we have enterprise processes. And I'll be honest, in my organization where I work, we tend to lean on logic apps for a lot of our enterprise processes. These are things that scale across big business units across the enterprise, and logic apps tends to work a little bit better for us in that capacity. And then lastly, as we're talking about this, in my organization, we have a self-service creation model. I'll teach you how to use these tools. I'll help answer some questions and provide some limited support, but it's up to the user to understand the ins and outs and to be able to maintain that process moving forward, because they own the business process. It's associated with their business unit and their data. So we're going to empower our users with this. So with that, specifically, when we start working in Power Automate, very quickly, you're going to run into expressions and functions. And it can be daunting for users to get started with expressions and functions. So we're going to try to demystify that a little bit, provide some simple examples of how we can do things like data management, filtering information efficiently so we can work with just the data we need and not have to parse through a whole bunch of data that we don't need. We're going to talk about how we can sometimes use expressions in place of conditions to get things done, again, minimizing some complexity in the workflow. When you start working with expressions, you're going to have to work with dates, approval dates, start dates for projects, end dates for projects. So we're going to talk about how to master the art of dates here. You're going to run across variables. Entering in the same data over and over and over is really inefficient. So if we can create a variable and then maybe compose that information later, then we can reuse that data in a lot of dynamic ways. We'll talk about if statements as well. If this, then that. That's a logical expression inside of the workflow. We're going to use a lot of compose actions. I'll show you some examples of that. And this is going to help not only with building the workflow, but also doing testing and debugging a little bit later. And testing and debugging is how we're going to be able to make sure that our workflows are running efficient. So with that, high level, I'm going to go through all of these topics a little bit interchangeably. I have them outlined in the presentation that I'm going to give, but they're going to overlap a little bit with one another. So as we're going through, as I'm talking about filtering, I'm going to be talking about a compose action, or I might be talking about an OData expression. As I'm working with the compose action, that's going to apply to like testing, but it's also going to apply to filtering. So it's going to be interchangeable in there. When we talk about condition controls and working with those, they're going to come in multiple places, whether it's a trigger to begin the workflow, or maybe as an action or a logical expression inside of the workflow as we're processing. Formatting dates is going to come up a whole bunch with this. And then the creation of variables, we'll talk about the best practices with that in just a moment. So first and foremost, you probably haven't read the manual, and that's one of the first things that I recommend for anybody who's going to get started with this. From learn.microsoft.com, they have the Microsoft Power Automate documentation page, and that's the best place to start if you're getting your feet wet or you're learning how to work in this platform. They'll walk you through the basics from getting started with templates to creating your own custom workflows to advanced documentation on the expressions and the functions that we're going to be working with. There's a number of self-paced modules in here for you to follow along with instructions and screenshots and build out some of these workflows, and then think about how you can apply that to some of your processes. But I strongly encourage everybody to read the manual. A lot of times we just dive in, we don't bother with it. But what you're going to find is not only is the manual super helpful to get you started, it's also super helpful to reference while you're actually building the workflow. So I typically have the manual open in a tab off to the side as I'm getting ready to work. And I recommend that you do the same thing. That way it's easy for you to go back and forth, look at the reference, look at the parameters, look at the data connection, and to really understand what you're able to do with that. So here you'll see I'm actually open to the Power Platform, the connector reference overview. That's going to tell me the data connectors, going to tell me which parameters that I can use, and they'll typically provide a couple of examples. But it's also going to provide information in the sidebar for additional resources. There you'll see maybe a list of Power Automate connectors, or maybe a community blog post around that, or maybe it'll take you to the Power Automate Tech community where people can ask questions and they can get responses from people that are in the know. So really helpful to have that open. And this is what I also use as part of building this. So when I'm working inside of Power Automate, you can click on the eye icon inside of any action. It shows up in the right-hand side of the action. From that eye icon, it'll open the help sidebar, and that'll show you the documentation for that specific action. It'll also show you tech community questions for that specific action, as well as maybe blog posts that they've referenced for that. So they're building the help in for you, and they're bringing it to you. They're automating that. It's brilliant. So take advantage of that connector reference by clicking on the eye icon and using that in the sidebar as you're working. So with that foundation laid, now let's actually get into this topic. Let's talk about expression basics. So expressions can be used in Power Automate in a whole bunch of different places. They can be used as a trigger. So when a workflow, a flow is started, there's a triggering event, whether we push a button and manually start that, whether it's automated based off of something happening, like an item being added to a SharePoint list, or maybe it runs on a schedule multiple times throughout the day. So we have triggers that kick off our workflow, but we can use expressions in those triggers. And one of the things that we can specifically do is to filter for certain criteria to begin the workflow and exclude all the things that we don't want. So for example, we could say that maybe a approval process is started and the status is set to in progress. So if the status is set to in progress, then the workflow actually triggers. But if the status is any other value, then the workflow doesn't trigger. It saves a flow run and then only runs on that data. This is an advanced example. We're going to build up to this, but we can use expressions as part of a trigger or a trigger condition. And you see here as a screenshot, an example of that. Most often though, you're going to be using expressions inside of actions. And that's the basic unit of work for any data connector that you're working with in Power Automate. So you're going to be able to use an expression as part of a get items action in SharePoint. You're going to be able to use an expression as part of a compose action or a data operations action. Depending on the data source, there are multiple expression types that are available, but these are the most common place that these are actually going to be used. And in some cases, Power Automate has actions that replicate expressions. So there might be an action block to convert time from UTC to the current time zone that you're in. There's an action for that as a date and time action, but you can also use an expression and do the same thing. So there's a little bit of overlap there, but expressions are typically used in our actions. Then we have conditions. This is the logic that we add to the workflow. If this, then that. If this value is X, do this. Else, if it's Y, do something else. So the conditions allow us to apply the logic to the workflow. And the most basic condition type that we have is the condition action that you actually see here. And it provides two avenues. If the condition is true, there's a yes branch, and if the condition is false, there's a no branch associated with it. But sometimes we want more control. For example, a nested condition. If this value is X and the status is set to in progress, go and do these things. So using like and or inside of there, conditions can get a little bit more complicated. But we can also use expressions as part of our conditions. So this is actually an older condition from an older templated workflow. And when you switch from the default editor into this is called the advanced editor. It shows you on the back end, they're simply using an expression to evaluate the outcome of that condition. So they're looking for a value, and then they got their true false statement based off of that. We can also leverage that same kind of syntax and build our own expressions if we need, and maybe not depend on the condition block in our workflow, especially as a workflow starts to get a little bit more complicated. Having multiple condition branches causes your workflow to spread out. It's hard to see everything. It's also really hard to debug later. Sometimes simplifying that with an actual expression can make the workflow much easier to debug later on. So that's the expression basics, but now let's talk about basic expressions. And I'm playing off the words there a little bit. So let's talk about the expression editor, which is what you see here. Whenever you're working with actions and you place your cursor in an action, this pops up, this box pops up, and it shows dynamic content by default, but there's also a tab in there for expression. So if you click on the expression tab, you're going to be able to work with the expression editor right up top. That's where the FX is. And then down below, you're going to be able to work with your functions. And so they're interchangeable. With expressions, you work with functions, and functions are part of expressions. We'll explain that more in depth in just a moment. But as I'm working with this in the FX box, that's where I'm going to build my expression. Create my expression, and I'll hit update. That'll add it to the action, to the trigger, or to the condition, and then it's going to be part of the workflow. Now, there's an advanced thing that Microsoft's just now starting to work with, and that's format your data. That means you give an example of the output and it creates the expression for you. So for example, if you want the date in a certain format, maybe you want a month, day, and 2-digit year in your format, you can provide that as an example and it'll write the expression for you. Works really well with simpler examples, but you can also go through the functions down below and build out your own expression using those functions. But just know that that format your data is a newer option, depends on some machine learning and Copilot, which is a hot term in the Microsoft world, but it depends on Copilot to build out that expression just based off of an example. And it does the expression building for you, which is pretty cool. But we're not going to do that today. We're going to build a lot of these by hand. All right, so in the expression generator, these are simply formulas. There's a certain syntax that's associated with it, but it allows you to manipulate the data within that particular action. They allow for dynamic customization of the actions and the conditions in the workflow. And to work with them, we simply enter in the expression using the syntax that they provide, and it'll tell you if there's an error inside of it, but it'll also start to give you some examples of how you want to build that out in the FX or dialog box. So what are some common expressions that you're going to come across whenever you're working in Power Automate? One of the biggest ones you're going to work with is concatenate. We call it concat. And what that's going to do is take two text strings, and it's going to put them together. So like, for example, you might have a SharePoint list with first name, last name, and you want another column for full name. You concatenate, put a space in there, and then you've got first name, last name, and it becomes the full name in the SharePoint list. Another very common expression you're going to work with is UTC now. This is the date and time built into the actual workflow. So working with UTC now, you might have to convert that to your time zone, because UTC now is the core that Power Automate uses to execute date-based actions. So I might need to convert that to my time zone, or I might need to format my date in a certain format so that it can work with SharePoint, for instance. We'll come back to that. I can also use expressions to filter out null or empty values. So if I'm using the expression of empty, I can remove or look for things that are null or empty, and I can avoid those in the workflow as part of the process. Another one is the ability to compare two text strings together, but capitalization matters. So we have the ability to convert to upper, and then it's just gonna convert both text strings to upper, and then you can do a simple comparison. And then there's the equals and the if statement. And these are typically used with your conditions. So I'm looking for some kind of value or some kind of evaluation. And then I use an if statement and equals, and I can say, value 1 is equal to this, run this set of actions, value 2 equal to that, run another set of actions. So these are some of the most common that you're actually going to see for our basic expressions. Now, from the syntax point of view, the editor kind of provides some guidance, but you still need to kind of point and click and mess with it a little bit to get started there. But as you start building it, you will see a pop-up just above the FX dialog that will tell you the function and the argument that it's looking for. And that's really what the expression editor is all about, functions and arguments. Function is the specific operation, like equals or concat or to upper. That's the function that I'm working with. The argument is the values and the inputs needed to make that work correctly. So if I'm going to do a concatenate, concat is the function, and then the argument is the text strings that I want to combine together. If I'm going to do like an if statement, I'm going to say if and a value, and then I'm going to have a true statement and a false statement for the arguments that go into that. And we'll show a couple of examples of this coming up in just a minute. So in my screenshot here, I'm doing an equals. So in that case, the function is equals, and then the argument is trigger body text. That's the first string, and then trigger body, and you can't see it, it falls off the screen, but that would be the second string. Then there would be a true statement and a false statement on the back end of that. So that's a little bit about getting started with the expression piece. What about the functions? So functions are predefined operations. So that's like concat, that's like length, that's like equals, that's like an if statement. These are predefined by Microsoft. This is what we can use to build out the actual expression. They have a syntax. So you have the function and you have the argument that you have to follow. And there's different syntax for each of the different actions, just depending on what the action or what the function actually is. So for example, if I'm going to do concatenate, I have to have text strings to merge together. So I might need two text strings to merge together. And I can add multiple by separating them with commas inside of the editor, but we're using predefined functions, operations from Microsoft to actually build out our functions. So with that, going back to some simple examples of functions, you're going to see there's some overlap with our expressions. Concat, combining two text strings. UTC now, working with date and time fields, formatting a date and time field in a certain manner. The length function, we use this a lot with arrays. We use this a lot when we're filtering data and debugging to make sure that we're getting the information that we need back. To upper and to lower, so that we can compare text strings together, regardless of how the user might have capitalized it. And then things like empty and null to find or exclude empty cells and null values so that we don't have to process over those. So those are some simple, commonly used functions that we have, but they overlap with some of the commonly used expressions. Now, they divide functions into about 10 different categories. There's strings, there's collections, there's logical and conversion functions, there's math, there's date and time referencing, there's workflow functions, there's URI parsing, and then there's manipulation. Depending on what you're doing is to the group and the function that you're going to work with. Some of the most basic that you're going to work with are the string and the date functions. Those are the most commonly used in most of the workflows that I'm working with. Some of the more advanced and rarely used ones for me are like the workflow. Your workflow has a unique ID associated with it and some unique parameters. And there is a function that allows you to work with that. So maybe you can do some advanced debugging or advanced reporting based off of your workflows using the workflow actions. But I'm going to stick to things like strings and collections, logic, math, and dates as part of today's session. So just starting out, I'm going to do just a brief, simple introductory demo into a couple of expressions and functions, some basics, and then we'll go from there. So let me actually slide over and share my screen. So I am in Power Automate now, and we'll do a simple expression function to kind of get things going. So I've got this one already pre-built. Let's actually go into the editor. All right, and for this particular one, I'm going to launch this with a manually triggered flow. Now, when you're getting started and just kind of learning this, the manually triggered option is great because you can add some inputs and then you can actually test and launch it pretty much right from here. You don't have to leave Power Automate. For example, I can go in and like it's saying, well, enter 2 numbers and then go ahead and run the flow. So the manually trigger one runs just like this. So it's a great way to test, great way to kind of get started, and later you can actually convert that over to a specific business process and connect it to SharePoint. So it's that easy to actually get started. And then as soon as you run a manually triggered flow, it's going to tell you the inputs and the outputs associated with it. So I inputted 2 numbers, 3 and 4. It's going to output that, and then it's going to send it to another action, and it's actually going to do something with that. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So working with getting started on this is a great way to do it, manually triggering a flow. Now I've got a compose action here and it's going to do something, but before I use that, I've got two fields here. I've added inputs to my workflow and I just did simple text inputs, strings essentially. So it's asking for numbers. Now I would typically go and add an action to this, and in the action, in this particular instance, I'm looking for a data operation action, and I'm just going to use the compose. This is great for debugging and testing. So I'm going to compose, and I get the compose action. Now, because I already have one on my editor, it's going to go ahead and auto increment that, and it's going to add a 2 to the end. So now I have 2 separate compose actions that I can look up dynamically. We'll see that in just a moment. And then it's telling me for inputs, what are your inputs? And by default, it's looking for dynamic content. So based off of the step above it, it's going to say, well, I can get the username, the email, the date, all of these values that you see here. I can actually pull from this action up top, and then you can use this as part of your workflow right over here. You can enter this into this compose action, but I'm not concerned with that. I want to do an expression. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to do an expression. So I have 2 text strings over here that I can potentially work with. So if I do an expression, I could take these 2 things and maybe concatenate them together. That's going to combine these text strings. So I'm going to concat. That adds that into the editor. I'll click on dynamic content, and from there, based off of the manually triggering a flow, I have the body that I can pull from. I have number 1 and I have number 2, and those are the inputs from the user right up here that I can reuse. So I'm just going to say concat. I'm going to say number 1, and then based off of the expression editor, I know I need to do the arguments of 2 text strings. So we separate that with a comma, and then this little box pops up and it's going to show me, okay, this is the format we're looking at. Text string number 1 separated from text string number 2 with a comma. It's required, combines this into a single string. It tells me what it actually does, and I can move through that. So it pops up as I'm actually working. So now I'm just going to go and add number 2 here. If it likes it, I'll say okay, and now I've added that as part of my input, so I concatenate it. So let's go and let's save this and let's actually run it. We're taking 2 strings and running them together. So we'll test, say manually and test, and I'll just enter 2 numbers again. I'm going to do just 3 and 4, and then I'm going to run the flow. All right, so then I'm done. And when we go and we look at the inputs, 3 and 4, we go to compose number 2, and it's 34. Because I'm concatenating, I'm putting 2 text strings together. It's not the actual, it looks like 34, but it just combined 3 and 4 with no space. So it did what I told it to do. It combined 2 text strings together, but if a user looks at that, they're going to think that's the value 34. And that might not be the intention, but I just wanted to show that simple example. All right, so if we're going to do this correctly, if I want to actually maybe take these 2 things and add them together, some users might want to go in first time they work with this and say, well, let's just take number 1 and then number 2, save that and output based off of that. That's not going to work, and I'll show you why. So we'll test again, 3 and 4. We'll run it, and when we get the output, we're going to see 3 plus 4, literally the string or the text. So we need to use a math function here. And again, this is just some basics to kind of get us started. So I'll go back into my expressions. I'll scroll down until I get to the grouping for math, and there's one for add. So add's going to allow me to add 2 text strings together. All right, so now I can go into dynamic content, and I can say, well, let's add number 1, and then add my comma, and it's going to say, okay, well, now we need number 2, so we'll add number 2, and then we'll say okay, and we'll go ahead and save that. And then I'm going to go back, and I'm just going to test again, and I'll just use some data from a previous run. I've done this a couple of times now. I've been using 3 and 4 as the primary values there, so I'll test based off of 3 and 4 again. And then when we go back and we see, okay, we inputted 3 and 4, and then we go back, and now we're getting the outcome that we want. In this case, it's 7. So that's a couple of simple examples to kind of get us started with the expression tool. So we want to talk about some more advanced things that we can do. So let's talk about compose a little bit. I was just using the compose action as part of this, and then I was working with some expressions and some functions. So what are some things that we can do with compose that are a little bit more advanced, but can provide some real insight, especially into working with like SharePoint? So the compose action allows us to basically define something and lock it in. When we compose it, we're not going to change it. We might change a variable, but we're not going to change like a compose action. So I'm going to use a compose to define something and then lock it in, but I can reuse it a whole bunch of times. But one of the places that compose is actually most valuable is when I'm getting items back from a list, like a SharePoint list, or I'm getting items back from Dataverse, for instance, because I can use compose to tell me how many things did I actually return, and then I can verify if that is correct or not. And I do that by using compose, and then I use a specific expression, and that's length. And length is going to tell me the total number of things that I'm actually returning. So compose is really helpful for that. So let's do an example of that with a SharePoint list. All right, so I'm going to head back into my Power Automate, and let's go. So I've got this filter list here. We'll talk about filters a little bit more in just a second, but I'm going to use this to kind of get started. So I'm going to manually trigger this flow, and I'm going to go to SharePoint, and I'm going to get items from a specific list right here. So I've got a list set up for my certification village. It's called an inventory list. I know how many items are there, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, I'm going to just cut this for the moment. I'll come back to that. And then I'm going to go down and I'm going to have a compose. And I've actually got the compose already predefined for the demo, but the compose is based off of the length function. So just to show you what that actually looks like, let me go and add a new action, new step down here. So we're going to do just data operations. I'm going to go and do compose. And then I'm just going to go in and use my expression editor. And I'm looking for, and I can just start typing and it'll autocomplete, but I could also search through here to find what I'm looking for. I'm going to go and say, I want length. And I need to open and close parentheses. And then I have to tell it the length of what. So I'm going to go back to dynamic content. And it's going to show me filter down to the things that I can use. So I'm looking for the get items, and I have a list of items and I have a value for the list of items. So I'm going to select the value here. I'm going to say OK. So that's the expression that I want to work with. I want to get the length of all of those items from this particular list. All right, so I'm going to save that, and then we're just going to go and test it. Now it's telling me that with the get items option or action that you should use an OData filter to improve the performance, and it's telling me that that's a warning. But it's not going to stop the flow from running. It's telling me that it's going to create an array, a list of items to get the data back from the SharePoint list. And so it's going to loop through that. And there are a number of items inside of there, and it's going to loop through until it gets everything. It's going to build an array. And it's telling me that it can filter that more efficiently by using an OData filter. We'll come back to that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and test this. And I'm going to run it. All right, and then we'll go and look at the editor. And so it went ahead and it got all the items. Now I could go and view the raw outputs of this. It's going to be in JSON. There's a lot of information there. If you're not familiar with this, it might be a little daunting to look at initially, but basically it's telling me that there's an item 5 inside of here. This one's telling me item 5. Go down, it's telling me there's an item 6 inside of here. Keep going, there's an item 7. So it's going to actually go through this entire list and show me everything that's there. But I don't want to do that manually. That's why I use the length option, because the length option is going to tell me how many things it counted from that list, how many things were actually returned. So if we were to go and take a look at that actual SharePoint list, so let's actually go and find our certification village. I know what the list that we're going to be working with is. So this is the inventory list that I connected that flow to. And I'm going to go in and see, okay, here's the list, items 1. And if we go all the way down, there's 25 there. But just to verify, I can run a total on this column in SharePoint. And it's going to tell me it's returning 25 items. So there should be 25 items coming back from this particular list. So it did return what we wanted. It gave me all 25 items. So that's what we can do with a simple compose action. It's really helpful for working with arrays and giving us the output based off of what it might see there. Now, let's go a little bit deeper. Now we're connecting to a SharePoint list, we're pulling back data. We might want to start to filter that to work with the list a little bit more efficiently. So filters in Power Automate allow us to narrow down to just what we need and exclude all the information that we don't need. We're going to talk about the limits that Power Automate and SharePoint have in just a moment, but by using filters, we can just narrow it down to run on the things that we want it to run on. And there's a number of different ways to filter. You can filter based off of a trigger condition. You can filter an array after you get information. You can use conditions to filter down. When you're doing your get items, you can do an OData filter. There's a bunch of different ways to do that. So say, for example, you've got a SharePoint list called task, and you want to see just the things that are marked as complete. Well, you can do a filter query with that. And so you would say the column where we work with the task status, called status, if status is equal to the value of completed, just return those values. Same thing with like dates. We can filter and say, just show things that are newer than this date, or show things that fall between these two dates. Filters are going to allow us to do some of that. And there's a bunch of different ways that we can filter. I'm going to go to the get items first, and we're going to filter there, and then I'll show you a couple other examples. All right, so let's go back into our demo. We're going to go back to the same get items that we were just working with. And right here, I have the filter query that's built right into the editor. And it tells you this is an OData filter query to restrict the entities that are returned. And it starts to give you an example: string, column, operator, and then some kind of value. As I'm building it, it's going to give me a little bit more information, but Microsoft's got a really good reference for that. And you can find that by going up here to the help option, and then follow the references off to the side. Now, I know what I want to filter on because I have this value. I'm looking for the reorder date from my list, and I do not want that to be equal to null. So any in this case is an operator for not equals, and I don't want a null value. So if we actually go back and look at the inventory list here, we're looking for the reorder value column in here, and it'll say whether it's going to, or the reorder date rather. We're looking for the reorder date inside of here, and we're looking for dates that are not blank. So we've got 1, 2, 3, we've got 4 inside of here that are going to be blank. So we want to return everything that does not have a blank value. So doing my math with the reorder dates there, we'll just do a count. There's 21 that actually have values in it. So let's actually go and run this workflow. So we'll test it. We'll run the flow. So we're getting items, and again, it's going to show me all the raw outputs. And then if I go down and I look at my compose, I'm returning 21 items. And if I wanted to verify, I could go into the JSON and I could see, okay, item number 1 and go through, and there's going to be a column here that's going to tell me a reorder date right here. So it is returning things that just have a reorder date associated with it. So the workflow actually worked. It returned the 21 items that I wanted. So that's a little bit more advanced example, but we're using, in this case, OData to filter out just to the things that we want. And I don't necessarily have to use a condition to find things that have a date for the reorder date versus things that don't. So that's an example of when I might want to actually replace a condition. We'll get into conditions more in a moment. So you can filter out null values with this, but you can also filter for certain types of things. So if there's certain values that you want to be present, the status field is in progress, we can filter about that. But it also allows you to do a couple of things. One, it allows you to work with pagination. So pagination is going to be the number of things that we're going to get in the first query, and then run another query, a pagination, how many things are we going to return that time? And we can run pagination multiple times, and we can return things in big batches. How do you do that? Well, you can go into the action or to the settings for this particular action, go to settings, and pagination is turned on. Retrieve items to meet the specific threshold with the continuation token. Due to the connector size, the items may be limited. So the maximum amount of things that I can return in a pagination threshold is 5,000. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But with pagination on, I can batch through a whole bunch of stuff. So that's an advanced feature in the SharePoint Get Items that you'll find inside of settings. And another thing that we can do is, if we know we're going to return a whole bunch of things, maybe we just put weight rather on the top level things. So we can do a top count. And a top count is, even though I might be able to get 5,000 here, just show me the 500 most important ones, and we can define that. But get the top count, just pull back the first 500. And then one last thing that you can do is to limit columns by the view. So if we go back and we look at our list here, I have a whole bunch of different columns, but I can create different views, and the different views allow me to pick and choose the columns that I want to see. So say, for example, I don't care about the description, for example. I could hide that. Maybe I don't need to know if this is hidden or not. Maybe I don't need to know for this particular view if this is discontinued. Now I've created a view, and if I were to name that particular view, if I were to give that a name, I'm narrowing down the fields that are visible, and I can actually take that over into this get items, and now it's just going to show me those columns, and it's going to exclude the columns that I actually hid, and we get that as part of the get items. So between those settings, we can really filter and narrow down and pull back exactly what we need. Now, there's a OData reference from Microsoft, and there's a whole bunch of blogs on this as well that are actually really helpful. It tells you the basic operators. EQ, that means equals. NE, not equals. LT, less than. LE less than or equal to, GT greater than, GE greater than or equal to, and then there's the joiners. And yes, you can combine inside of there a couple of different OData filters. So filter out the null values and look for reorder dates that are within 7 days of today's date. You could definitely do that. Now, I mentioned SharePoint limits. The default number of items that you're going to get is 100, and then pagination is there as a default option. But if you want to work with large SharePoint lists, we still have the view limit threshold of 5,000 items. So if you have more than 5,000 items in your list, filters are going to be really essential to narrow that down and try to get below that limit. Is it possible to work with more than 5,000 items? Absolutely. But filtering is going to be a key part of that, and it gets a little bit more complex along the way. All right, next up, let's go into our date formatting. So one of the simplest ways to work with Power Automate is to work with dates. Dates are actually really important, especially for things like approvals. If there's an approval, there's usually a due date associated with that. Start dates and end dates and reorder dates. But as soon as you start working with dates in Power Automate, you're going to run into UTC. UTC time needs to be converted to your time zone so that the values actually show up correctly for the users that are in that particular time zone. So UTC now is going to be really helpful. And then you can add to that expression by adding functions like adding days. So if I wanted to add days to something, I could say add days, that's my expression, UTC now, comma 1, and that's going to add 1 day to that thing, and then we could use that maybe to calculate out the end time. So working with dates, you're going to have to get comfortable with the UTC. Now, when you work with this, it's really important that, especially in the SharePoint world, that you use the column's internal name. So SharePoint columns have an internal name. There's a couple of different ways to get that. I'll show you that in just a second. But then you have to put that in single quotes. And if you need to format it, you have to use the format time function. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this. I'll come back to this in just a moment. So let's head back into my flows, and I'll show a simple example of this. And what I'm looking for is, I use this one for this particular demo. So let's go and edit. All right, so what I want to do is I want to create a way to reference a specific date and time. Actually, let me go back. There's one more that's a little bit better. This one right here. All right, so I'm getting items from a SharePoint list. So I'm selecting an item in a SharePoint list. I'm getting the values there. Now, we haven't talked about variables yet. I'm going to talk about that in just a second, but I'm going to create a variable and I'm going to compose it based off of the output there. And then I'm going to update the item with that output. So let's look at the item first. So in my inventory list, I have an ID field provided by Microsoft, but maybe I want to provide my own inventory ID. Maybe there's a certain prefix that I want to highlight. Maybe there's a fiscal period that I want to highlight as well. So I can create my own inventory ID, but I need to build the expression around that. And the way that I'm going to do that in this particular case is to initialize a variable. And I'm going to do this in a smart way. So it is possible for me to do create an inventory ID that looks something like this. So I could say, well, let me just add a compose. So we'll do a data operation and say, well, let's go ahead and just compose this this outcome. And I know what I want. I want it to concatenate. So concat, and I would say like maybe I want the prefix ID to be, maybe this is like project ABC, and then I want to combine that with a maybe a dash, and then I want to combine that with maybe that default dynamic ID that Microsoft creates. So like that would create an outcome for me. That would give me ABC dash and then the like hard-coded essentially the thing that that I want, but I don't want to have to go back and update this, especially if I'm dealing with like a year. So by hard coding it like this, there's nothing really dynamic in it other than the ID. But if I were to do something like here where I format the date UTC now, and output it as a 2-digit year. So now I'm getting a date as a 2-digit year, and as the calendar rolls over, it's going to say, okay, it was 2023 yesterday, now it's 2024. Now we have that as a dynamic value. Then I can go into my compose and I can concatenate and say, well, let's take the ID from that thing, and then let's add a dash to it, and then let's add that variable of the dynamic 2-digit year and use that as the output for updating this item instead. And that might be a smarter way, because I only have to build this once, and then I'll have to go back and reference it down the line. And I'm taking advantage of another trick in Power Automate. It's really helpful to add notes to your actions and your conditions, because you can drop the formula in the note, and you don't have to do the hover over, and you don't have to go back to the dynamic lookup to see what's there. You can see exactly what's there. So my formula is I'm concatenating the item's ID. I am adding a space inside of there, or adding a dash, and then I'm saying go back and get my variable that I created up here based off of the format time and the 2-digit year. And then I'm going to reference that in my inventory ID. And so that's a very powerful way to create something dynamic based off of a date field. Now, I pulled an example and put this in the PowerPoint. I wanted to see it. The most common issue that I see with dates, especially in the tech forums, is getting the expression right for working with that. This is an example. My friend and colleague Scott Shear, he's a Microsoft MVP out of the Washington D.C. area. He was answering some questions on the tech community, and he does this one a fairly good bit. So someone was working with formatting a date, and they needed to change the format to meet the SharePoint format, and the SharePoint format is year, month, and day, and it needs to be in that particular format, and then from there the expression goes inside of the single text. So this one's very common when you're working, like, for example, filtering by OData and looking for a date expression. It needs to be in the format like you see here: format, date, time, UTC now, year, month, day with 4-digit, and then you're going to compare against the expression there for that. And this is what it would look like if you actually built it out. All right, so that's high level of working with dates. Let's continue forward. So simplified controls. So we're going to replace some conditions with some simplified expressions. I've talked about this one a couple of times. Now I'm going to show it a little bit more in depth. The trigger condition is probably the most powerful version of this. Rather than running the workflow and then looking for a logical operator, a condition, we're telling the workflow to only run when this condition is present. It saves flow runs, also allows us to go ahead and narrow down the data, maybe a list view threshold of 5,000 items, maybe narrow that data down to a subset of data within that particular list, and only execute if that kind of trigger condition equals to true. So from a trigger, we would go into settings. From the settings, we would look for trigger conditions at the bottom, and we're just going to use a simple expression. The only frustration is that this is not dynamic. It's not going to help you to build the expression. You have to enter in the syntax yourself, but there's a way around that. We can go to a compose action in the workflow and then copy and paste into the trigger action up at the top, and just add an @ sign at the very beginning. So this is probably one of the most powerful ones that we actually have. So for this particular example, let's go back to my flows, and let's see which one is it. I think it's this one. I try to provide detailed names so I know where to go in the demo. Nope. Tell you what, we'll just create this one really quickly. Well, hold on. So we'll go into settings, and then trigger condition is actually turned off here. So we would add, and this is where we would add the trigger condition. Now I need to look at the list that this is going to. So this is going to my certification village. So I need to apply the trigger condition for that to narrow it down specifically to get just the values that I want. So in this case, I might want to be filtering if the value, for example, was like the reorder date was set to null. Now, the OData is not going to work here. I'll show you that. It's going to give me an error. It's not actually going to run off of that. I would actually have to use an expression that's going to look like equals trigger output and then the value that I want. And one of the best ways to do that is actually go and actually run a compose action. So you could go and say add an action, data operations, compose, and then we would do expression, and in this case we're looking for an equals, and then we just have to tell it what the equals is for. So we're looking for, in this case, equals, and from the get items we can look for specific columns. So maybe I'm looking for the reorder date, for example, and let's see if I passed it already. We'll just do reorder level. I would say reorder level and then the value that I want with that. And once I've created that expression, so we'll say 15, see if it likes that. And once I've created that, I basically have what I need for that output. So I would just copy that, and then I could take that back into here. And then now with the @ sign at the beginning, I've created that dynamically just using the compose, and I can get rid of the compose now. I don't need it anymore, and I can remove that, and I can use that as an advanced trigger action to run just when this starts. There's some really good blogs. John Liu, Microsoft MVP out of Australia, has some really great blog posts on that. Highly recommend you check that out. In the PowerPoint, I did include some breakdowns of the expression operators that you can use as part of that, like and or and equals. So that'll be available. And then I just wanted to show like maybe a simple if statement. So I could run an if statement in there. I could also run an equals inside of there, and provided that along with an example of looking for something, trigger condition, filtering out blank values. All right, lastly, I know we just got a couple of minutes left. I've done variables a couple of times, and I just wanted to briefly explain the difference between a variable and a compose. A compose, when you build it, you're locking something in. A variable is something that can be updated. You initialize a variable, you increment and update that variable, you append to that variable on the way, and so you can reuse some of that information throughout the workflow. The great thing about variables is that it allows me to define something one time and reuse it many times. So if I were going to maybe run an approval process on a SharePoint item, and I was going to use the approval action built in to Power Automate and maybe work with email and Teams for messaging, I could use a variable to craft the message and then reuse that in both the email and the messaging that I send in Teams and not have to duplicate that information. The higher up in the workflow that I create the variable, the more globally reusable it is through all the subsequent actions that happen down below. If I know that the variable is going to reach a certain point where I want to lock it, then I'll drop it into a compose, and I won't be able to output on that anymore. But if I'm going to be incrementing against it throughout the workflow, I initialize it up top, and then I can increment and manipulate it through strings and functions down below. So I had a couple of examples as we were working through with that, but you'll find variables along with compose inside of your data actions. I provided a link to the documentation for some of that. And then lastly, and I'm trying to make sure we stay within the time here, the if statement, I showed a couple of examples along with that, but I did drop these into the PowerPoint. As far as debugging goes, I use the compose action heavily for that. I showed a couple of expressions with that, such as the length, in order to get values back. But testing and debugging is going to be a big part of that. Compose really helps with that. Add your notes inside. That's going to tell you exactly what that formula is. You can do that for almost any action. And then using things like length can tell you how many things you're actually getting back from an array, like a get items inside of SharePoint. Super helpful with that. So I know we need to take some questions. I did the data operations. I'm going to switch over now to any questions that you have as it relates to getting started with formulas and expressions and functions inside of Power Automate, especially working with SharePoint.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy, for a great presentation. So there's just a few questions in here. So the first one I see is, does excluding columns by using certain view give better performance on large data sets?
Yes, so and that's actually going back to the SharePoint get items. I'll pull that up real quick while we're talking about it. But filtering and limiting by the views, it just excludes those columns, and so it doesn't need to pull down that data. That can increase the performance slightly as you're working with it, but from a debugging standpoint and from a creating standpoint, it can save you significant amount of time, because when you're going through the dynamic editor down here, this is what everything that I'm getting from the get items. These are all the columns that I'm getting here. And so if I limit it by view, I can exclude some of those columns, and that's going to make things easier for me to get to what I need. But also when I go back to debug, it's going to make things easier for me, because those are columns that I don't have to sort through in order to find what's wrong with the workflow.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Andy. So there's just another question here, and someone wants to know how to disable the Teams notification when we used approval action.
That depends on how the flow was created. If it was created from a template that has the Teams notifications built into it, if it was a custom workflow that you tied in to Teams notifications, or if you're using like assigning tasks through like Planner and To Do, that's going to tie right into the Microsoft Teams and the task center that's built in there. That one's nuanced. I'd have to see it to be able to tell you specifically with that. Users can control their own notifications, so they have the ability to go into the team settings and control the notifications there. But that one really just comes back to, how was the flow built? Was it a template? Was it custom? Or is it using actions that tie into like Planner and To Do, and then bringing that to the user? You'd have to look at that one to know for sure.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. So just a follow-up then from that question, they're saying they don't want to do the settings in Teams. Is that possible to do in the flow?
Again, it depends on how the flow is built. What actions is the flow calling? How is it tying in into Teams for the user? Is it an approval in Teams that then connects to the Teams approval center area? Is it tied into Planner and To Do? I would have to see it to be able to tell you specifically how to minimize some of the notifications coming through Teams there. But it sounds like it's built to interact with Teams, and so by default, it's going to provide notifications in Teams for the user that their approval process is happening.
Brilliant. Thanks again, Andy. So another question then, someone's asking, if you use pagination, do you have to use and apply for each to cycle through the pages?
So that one's going back to like the get item or get items rather. So in that particular case, you're paginating through, it's going to create arrays. So every time it goes through, it's going to create an initial array or set of values. So you would need to parse through each individual array in order to work with the values that it's receiving. There is a way to consolidate some of that after it comes through. There's a really great blog, I believe Tom Riha, R-I-H-A, Tom Riha, has a really great blog on that, where you can talk about some advanced pagination options. That would be a resource that I would go and look at, but it is going to return that in batches, and then you would need to parse through it.
Brilliant. Thanks again, Andy. And just a follow-up from the previous question. The same person is saying, if we use approval action in Power Automate, it'll throw an error like this user doesn't have permission to create a database in Dataverse. If I'm using environments as a user, how do they enable it for users in environments?
So environments have security around them. Certain sets of people can work within various environments. So if you're building solutions across environments, you're going to be managing basically owners and members inside of those environments. So if you're getting an error, it's because someone's not authenticated inside of that particular environment. You would go to the environment and you would set up the membership there.
Perfect. And they're just saying here that they don't have admin rights.
You're going to have to work with your admins there. Based off of the solution, you're going to have to showcase the solution that you're building, talk about the user access and control, the value to the organization, and get your admins to actually set up the access to that particular environment for those users to be able to work with those solutions.
Great. And they are just wondering, as a developer, is there any other way?
Not if you're using separate environments, not to my knowledge.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Andy. So there's just one last question in here, and someone is asking, how can you format dates in Power Automate to better work with SharePoint data?
So I tried to address that specific one in the PowerPoint. Let me actually go back to that, and we can make it available. But when you're working with the PowerPoint dates, it depends on whether you're working with date or time. But if you're working with SharePoint list columns, for example, SharePoint library columns, you're going to want to be working with, for just dates, you're going to be working with this format: year, month, day. That's what you're going to want. For example, UTC now, this is the format that I want to output with that. If you're working with time as well, the default UTC, I believe, will match up with that. I'd have to double check on that. Actually, thankfully, I have my notes open. Yeah, if you're working with time, one second. The time should be formatted, but you just need to convert it to the current time. But UTC now, and this is the default format that you want. There's a blog post, and I believe I linked it in the notes in the PowerPoint from Microsoft, where they talk specifically around all the different formats that are there. But this is the most common one that we have, because most date columns, we're just looking for date and not necessarily date and time. So this is the format you want here.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. So one question just came in there, and someone wants to know any key things to avoid while building a flow to improve performance.
Try to keep it simple. I know that sounds obvious, but when you start building really complex workflows, and the more actions that you start adding into that, the more complex it's going to be, the harder it's going to actually be to go back and debug later. I don't have an example in this tenant to show you, but the more complex it is, the harder it is for somebody else to come back in and debug it after the fact. The harder it's going to be for you to go back and work with it after the fact. And using nested conditions. Here's a condition branch, yes, no, and then here's another nested condition branch inside of the yes area. That gets really, really complicated. Try to avoid nested conditions as much as possible. For example, if I had a 3-stage approval process, I would probably create 3 approval workflows and have a separate list where I say, okay, approval 1's done, now kick off approval 2. Approval 2's done, now kick off approval 3. That gets me 3 distinct approvals values to work with, versus if I did that as approval 1, nested approval 2, nested approval 3. What happens if approval 3 times out? Well, then I got to go back to number 1 and number 2, and they've already done their approval action. Now we're repeating work. But if I separate that into 3 distinct approvals with a second list off to the side, that's simpler for me to debug. And if approval 3 times out, I can just restart it, and I don't have to go back through approval 1 and 2 for that. So sometimes breaking it up into smaller chunks and simplifying it can be a huge benefit to you from a debugging process, but also maintaining it long term.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Andy. So that seems to be, sorry, just one question came in there, and we might wrap it up then after that. So someone is saying that they try to use one SharePoint action create sharing link for file or folder for a newly created SPL. I'm getting an error like external sharing is disabled on this site. How can they enable through flow by sending HTTP request to SharePoint? If you show API key and body is very helpful.
That one is really complicated. The HTTP action for SharePoint is getting into more of the low code-based solution. I can't demo that here on this particular call. I can give you an idea of what something like that might look like, but basically, for that particular one, you're sending an HTTP request to SharePoint. I would do something like this particular one. I've got an API call to the Microsoft Graph essentially, and I'm looking for the members of a specific SharePoint group. I can't answer that one specifically because external access is turned off. That's an admin setting. You'd have to work with your administrators on that, and then getting into the nuances of this gets developer heavy really quickly. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. That's one you might need to consult with a consultant on and work with your admins on for the limitation with the external access.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Andy. So we'll wrap up the Q&A session there. But I just want to say a huge thank you, Andy, to yourself on behalf of the ESPC community for taking the time today to carry out this webinar. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to do it and spread the information about SharePoint and Power Automate.
Brilliant. So that is the end of today's webinar. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today. Take care, and we hope that you'll join us again for more learning. Bye for now.
Thanks, everybody.